How a tiny wound could become a death sentence. How humans treated wounds before antibiotics. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you no longer live in the modern world. There is no phone in your pocket, no car waiting outside, no hospital just minutes from your home. Instead, you have traveled thousands of years into the past. You wake just before sunrise, not because of an alarm clock, but because the cold has awakened you. You feel the icy air against your face. The wind slips through the animal skins wrapped around your body. Slowly, you open your eyes. You find yourself inside a simple shelter. Its walls are made of stone and wood. Its roof keeps out only part of the rain, and only a little of the warmth. Outside, there are no engines, no city noise, only the whistle of the wind, the rustling of trees, the distant calls of birds, and perhaps the howl of a wolf somewhere nearby. Every morning begins with the same question: will I make it back alive before sunset? Life in those days was never easy. People feared not only hunger, not only the cold, not only wild animals. They feared everything. A simple fall could become a broken bone that never healed. A hunting trip could become the last journey of your life. Even searching for food was a risk you might never return from. Winter was a merciless enemy. Snow covered the land. Freezing winds cut through even the thickest clothing. Fire was the only thing standing between life and death. But even fire could not be taken for granted. If the flames went out, you might spend hours trying to bring them back. And if you failed, you could face an entire night in deadly cold. Yet despite all these dangers, there was another enemy, one that almost no one ever thought about. An enemy that could not be seen, could not be heard, and whose presence could never be felt. Yet it waited patiently. All it needed was a tiny wound, a small scratch, or a single thorn piercing the skin, and then a battle would begin, one that no one could see. This morning, you set out once again to search for food, but you have no idea that a single tiny wound is about to change everything. It seems like an ordinary day, or at least that's how it begins. You wake with the first light of dawn. You eat a simple meal, barely enough to give you the strength for the day ahead. Work is waiting, and before dark kness falls, you must gather firewood. You have no idea that today will be different from every day that came before, and it won't be because of a hungry wolf, or a fierce snowstorm, or a war. Instead, it will all begin with a tiny wound. The path to the forest isn't far, but it's covered with rocks, dry branches, and slippery ground left behind by last night's rain. At last, you arrive and begin your work. One swing, then another. The sound of your axe blends with birdsong and the rustling of the trees. An hour passes, perhaps two. You've gathered enough firewood to take back home, but as you reach for one last piece of wood, your foot slips. You struggle to regain your balance, but it's too late. You fall. Your leg scrapes against the sharp edge of a rock. A sudden sting. You look down. It's only a small cut. A little blood begins to flow. It doesn't seem serious. You wipe the blood away with your hand, then stand up. The firewood matters more than the wound, and your family is waiting for you. So you continue your work as if nothing had happened. On the way home, the bleeding begins to stop. You feel reassured. Perhaps you even forget the wound is there at all. But while you were focused on carrying the firewood, something else had already begun its journey. A journey you could never see, and one you wouldn't even notice until it was far too late. At that moment, the man believed that the worst part was the pain, but he had no idea that the real danger hadn't even begun. So what really happens inside the human body just seconds after a tiny wound, and can the body defend itself without a single medicine? The very moment the rock scraped your leg, the wound wasn't the first thing your body cared about. There was something far more urgent, stopping the bleeding. Every drop of blood was precious, and in a world where blood transfusions did not exist, continuous bleeding could mean the difference between life and death. That's why your body went to work within a fraction of a second. Tiny blood vessels immediately narrowed, slowing the flow of blood. Then, platelets, tiny cells, invisible to the naked eye, rushed toward the wound. They clung to one another, forming a temporary barrier, almost like an emergency repair crew racing to seal a damaged road before it completely collapsed. Moments later, an intricate web of microscopic fibers wrapped itself around that barrier. The flowing blood gradually transformed into a stable clot, protecting the wound and preventing further blood loss. But while the body was building this protective barrier, another problem had already begun. Your skin is far more than just a covering. It is a natural fortress, protecting you from millions of microscopic organisms living in the air, the soil, the water, and even on the surface of your own skin. The instant the wound opened, a tiny doorway appeared in the wall of that fortress, a doorway through which microbes could try to enter. Under normal circumstances, your immune system was already prepared. It immediately dispatched white blood cells. These cells moved like soldiers, responding to an urgent alarm. They rushed straight toward the site of the injury, searching for anything that did not belong, destroying it before it could spread. And in many cases, they succeeded. The wound healed, the infection never took hold, and within days, the person forgot it had ever happened. But not always. If the wound was contaminated, if too many microbes entered the body, or if the person was exhausted, weak, or suffering from poor nutrition, the balance could begin to shift. And when it did, the battle was no longer in humanity's favor. For the first time since the beginning of this ordinary day, the real danger was drawing near. But the man felt nothing. All he could see was a tiny wound, and all he believed was that it would disappear within a day or two. The next morning, you wake, just as you always do. You climb out of your simple bed, but something feels different. There's a strange heaviness in your leg. You look at the wound. The skin has become redder, warmer, and slightly swollen. You touch it. A dull ache greets your hand, but you smile. It seems normal. This is how wounds heal, isn't it? You put on your clothes and head back to work. The fields will not wait, and firewood will never gather itself. The hours pass, but the pain doesn't fade. Instead, it slowly grows worse. With every step, the sting becomes sharper. Yet, you keep working, because in those days, no one stopped working over a tiny wound. But inside the wound, a real battle had already begun. Immune cells poured into the injured tissue, trying to contain any microbes that had entered through the broken skin. In many cases, they succeeded. The body recovered, the wound healed, and the person never even realized that an entire battle had taken place inside their body. But if the bacteria managed to overcome those defenses, the infection began to spread. The redness became more intense. The swelling continued to grow. The pain became harder to ignore. Yet these signs were not the disease itself. They were evidence that the body was fighting back with everything it had. As the sun begins to set, you make your way home. Slowly, carefully, trying not to reveal your pain. You sit beside the fire. You rinse the wound with a little water, then cover it with the cleanest cloth you can find, and you hope that tomorrow will be better. But tomorrow will bring terrible news. The night passed slowly. The cold was relentless, but the pain was even worse. As the first light of dawn began to appear, you opened your eyes and looked at the wound. It was no longer the same. The skin around it had become redder, more swollen, and when you touched it, it felt warm. You paused for a moment, then quietly told yourself, it'll heal on its own. In those days, there were no doctors, no medicine, and no one understood what was happening inside the body. So you left, as you always did, but your steps were slower now. As the hours passed, the pain continued to grow, as if something was quietly growing beneath the skin. By the time you returned home at sunset, you removed the cloth covering the wound, and then you realized it was no longer just a scratch. The redness had spread, the swelling was far more obvious, and a thick, yellow fluid was draining from the wound. You had no idea what it meant, but inside the wound, the bacteria had already begun to multiply. At the same time, your immune cells were fighting without rest, trying to contain the infection, trying to stop it from spreading. In many cases, they succeeded. But if the bacteria managed to overcome those defenses, the infection would continue to spread. Soon, the entire body became part of the battle. Your temperature began to rise. Exhaustion took over. Your appetite disappeared. Even standing became harder than it had been the day before. These symptoms were not the disease itself. They were evidence that the body was fighting with everything it had left. But in those days, no one knew the truth. Some believed it was a curse. Others claimed evil spirits were responsible, but the truth was both simpler and far more dangerous. The bacteria were continuing to spread. Several days passed. The pain was no longer confined to your leg. It had spread throughout your entire body. You tried to stand, but the world began to spin. You shivered, even beside a warm fire. Your fever continued to rise. And now, the wound itself was no longer the greatest danger. If the bacteria reached the bloodstream, the entire body was at risk. Your immune system fought desperately to stop them, but the battle was no longer an easy one. Today, doctors understand how to treat cases like this, but back then, no one knew what was happening. People saw a strong man who had walked into the forest only days earlier to gather firewood, and now he could barely stand. His family gathered around him. His wife placed a cool cloth across his forehead. The neighbors brought herbs and prayed that he would survive. But the truth was that they were not fighting the wound. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, an enemy that killed slowly. But was humanity completely helpless, or did people fight back using everything they had learned through experience, observation, and the wisdom passed down from one generation to the next? Before we judge ancient medicine, we must first go back and discover how people struggled to save the wounded long before the discovery of antibiotics. While the man lay inside his shelter, struggling with fever, he had no idea that thousands of people before him had faced the very same fate. Yet humanity did not simply stand by and surrender. For thousands of years, every civilization searched for a way to defeat this invisible enemy. The problem was, no one even knew it existed. Thousands of years before hospitals, before antibiotics, before anyone even knew that germs existed, people treated wounds with whatever nature provided. There were no laboratories, no medicines, no surgical instruments, only experience, observation, and sometimes pure luck. The first priority was always to stop the bleeding. Then, if water was available, they washed the wound, or simply brushed away the dirt with their hands. After that, they tried to cover it with animal hides or leaves from nearby plants, hoping to keep dirt away from the wound. But none of these methods could stop what no one could see. The real enemy wasn't the dirt alone. It was the microscopic organisms whose existence was still completely unknown. As centuries passed, people began to notice something curious. Some natural substances seemed to help wounds heal, while others only made them worse. And that was the beginning of humanity's search for better wound care, a journey that would continue for thousands of years. Now, let's travel back more than 3,000 years to ancient Egypt. There, physicians treated wounds with remarkable care. For their time, they cleaned the wound first, then applied honey, sometimes natural oils, and finally wrapped it with clean linen bandages. They had no idea that bacteria were responsible for infection, nor did they know that honey could slow the growth of certain bacteria. But through observation, they noticed that some wounds healed better when honey was used. Their knowledge was built through experience, not through microscopes. Today, we know that honey contains natural properties that can slow the growth of certain bacteria. Even so, this treatment did not always work. If the infection spread deeper into the body, there was nothing they could do to stop it, and many people lost their lives, despite every attempt to save them. But the Egyptians were not alone on this journey. Around the same time, another great civilization was also trying to understand wounds and discover how to treat them. In the land of Mesopotamia, where the world's first cities were born, there, a wound was never simply ignored. Healers turned to plant oils, tree resins, and medicinal herbs in an effort to protect the wound from contamination. They often combined these treatments with rituals and beliefs they thought could drive illness away, because in those days, no one knew that microscopic organisms were everywhere, in the air, in the water, on the skin, and so, whether a treatment worked was often a matter of chance. One person might survive, their wound would slowly heal, while another, with what seemed to be the very same injury, could develop an infection that no one could stop. despite everything humanity had learned, one question remained unanswered. Why did some people survive, while others died from the very same wound? And so, the search continued, generation after generation, until it reached another civilization, one that would change the way people thought about treating wounds. Centuries passed, and in ancient Greece, a new chapter began. The Greeks had arrived. After them came the Romans. On the battlefields, wounds were an everyday reality. Military surgeons gained extensive experience treating injuries. Physicians also began to look at wounds in a different way. They believed that the body needed to restore its natural balance, so they focused on cleaning wounds. Surgery itself became more advanced. Doctors began washing wounds, removing damaged tissue, and sometimes they turned to cauterization, using fire to seal the wound. It was extremely painful, but they believed it could prevent certain injuries from becoming worse. In some cases, simply stopping the bleeding was enough to save a person's life. They also used wine and sometimes vinegar in an attempt to clean the wound. Some of these methods were an improvement over those that came before, but they still were not enough. Again and again, a wound would seem to be healing, only for the infection to return. No one knew why. They could see the outcome, but they could not see the enemy. For century after century, humanity continued treating wounds, never realizing that the real battle was being fought against an entire world, invisible to the naked eye. And so, the world entered one of the darkest chapters in the history of medicine. The Middle Ages, an era of herbal remedies, ancient traditions, and desperate hope. Then, as the Islamic Golden Age began to flourish, medicine took an important step forward. Physicians started recording their observations with remarkable precision. They described different types of wounds. They emphasized the importance of cleaning them, changing dressings, and carefully watching for signs that a wound was getting worse. These medical writings were built upon observation, experience, and knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. It's true, they knew nothing about bacteria, but they recognized that certain practices improved the chances of recovery, while others made wounds far worse. Yet, despite all these advances, one question still remained. Why did some patients survive, while others died, even though their wounds looked almost identical? The answer was hidden in a world no one had ever seen, a world that humanity would not discover for centuries to come. For thousands of years, humanity treated wounds without ever knowing its true enemy. But then, in the 17th century, a simple lens began to reveal a world no one had ever imagined. A hidden world filled with living organisms, too small to be seen by the naked eye. From that moment on, a journey began, one that would change medicine forever. For thousands of years, humanity lived alongside an enemy it could not see. It touched it, breathed it, carried it on its own skin every single day. And yet, no one even knew it existed. Disease was a mystery, and infection was an even greater one. Why would one person die from a tiny wound, while another survived a far more serious injury? No one had the answer, until a Dutchman appeared in the 17th century. He wasn't a physician, nor a university professor. He was a cloth merchant. His name was Antonie van Leeuwenhoek. He was fascinated by lenses, and crafted them with a precision unlike anything the world had ever seen. Then one day, he decided to examine a drop of water through one of his lenses. He had no idea that this single glance would forever change humanity's understanding of life itself. What he saw was astonishing. Tiny living creatures, moving in every direction, organisms no human being had ever observed with such clarity. He called them little animalcules, because he had no idea what they really were, nor did he realize that he had just opened the door to an entirely new world. A world teeming with life, inside a drop of water, on the surface of the skin, inside the mouth, within the soil, and almost everywhere else. But despite this extraordinary discovery, no one connected these tiny creatures with disease. The world would wait nearly 200 more years before an idea emerged that would transform medicine forever. In the 19th century, a French scientist named Louis Pasteur demonstrated that these microscopic organisms were not merely tiny creatures living around us. They could also be the cause of infection and disease. Only a few years later, a British surgeon named Joseph Lister asked himself, A simple question: if these organisms cause wound infections, why not destroy them before they enter the body? He began cleaning surgical instruments, using antiseptic solutions before every operation. The results were extraordinary. Death rates fell to levels never seen before. For the first time, humanity began to understand its true enemy. But even then, one question still remained: what if the bacteria had already entered the body? How could they be stopped? The world was still waiting for one more discovery, a discovery that would save hundreds of millions of lives. Humanity had finally identified its invisible enemy. It had learned NCE bacteria, how to keep it out of a wound, but onto the body. Doctors had no weapon powerful enough to stop them. Then, one unexpected moment changed the story, all because of an accident no one saw coming. For centuries, doctors understood the problem, but they had no solution. They cleaned wounds, used antiseptics, and did everything they could to prevent infection before it began. But once bacteria entered the body, there was nothing that could stop them. Doctors watched their patients grow weaker day after day. They understood what was happening, yet they were powerless until an ordinary morning in 1928, inside a small laboratory in London, a physician and bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned to his laboratory after a short holiday. As always, he began sorting through his bacterial culture plates. But one dish caught his attention. It had been contaminated by mold. Ordinarily, any scientist would have thrown it away. But Fleming paused. He looked one more time. Then he noticed something that made no sense. Around the mold, the bacteria had disappeared, as if there were an invisible barrier they could not cross. He stood there in silence, studying what he saw. Then a question entered his mind. What if this mold was producing a substance that killed bacteria? That single question marked the beginning of a medical revolution. Fleming discovered that the mold released a remarkable substance, later named penicillin. But the medicine wasn't ready yet. It would take years of research and the work of many other scientists to purify it, produce it on a large scale, and make it available to treat patients. Then, during the Second World War, penicillin began to be used on a massive scale. For the first time, doctors could treat many infections that had once been a death sentence. A tiny wound that only yesterday could have ended a person's life had now become, in many cases, completely treatable. The world had changed, and the fear of even the smallest wound would never be quite the same again. But was the battle finally over? Sadly, no. You might think that the story of infection ends here, but the truth is, the bacteria never surrendered. Just as humanity learned how to fight them, they, too, began to change, to evolve, to adapt, and to resist. Today, scientists warn that some antibiotics no longer work as effectively as they once did. So the question is, could the world one day return to a time when a tiny wound was once again a death sentence? For the first time in human history, a true humanity-possessed weapon against infection. Hospitals were filled with patients whom doctors had already given up on. But after receiving penicillin, their fevers began to fall, the infections stopped spreading, and many returned to their lives. For a moment, it seemed as though humanity had finally won. But nature never stops changing. Bacteria are not static organisms. They reproduce at remarkable speed, and with every new generation, tiny changes can appear, changes that allow some of them to survive. When antibiotics are used incorrectly, or when they are taken without being needed, the susceptible bacteria are destroyed. But those with natural resistance may survive. They multiply, and over time, some strains become far more difficult to treat. That is why doctors today warn against the unnecessary use of antibiotics, not because these medicines no longer work, but because their effectiveness can only be preserved if they are used responsibly. If the man who suffered that tiny wound could return today and see modern hospitals, sterile operating rooms, antibiotics, and emergency medicine, he would surely believe he was living in a world of pure imagination. A single wound once had the power to decide his fate. Today, in many cases, it can be treated, but this extraordinary achievement is not something we can assume will last forever.